It is said that windows are meant to protect us. They give us light, they let us see the world outside, but they also leave us exposed. They are a thin layer of glass separating comfort from danger. Many of us close our curtains at night without a second thought, believing that what is on the other side does not matter. But for one young woman, what stood beyond her window changed her life forever. This is not the kind of story filled with rumors or exaggerations. This is a true account of a woman who discovered that her neighbor, the man she thought she only saw through the glass of the building opposite her, might not have been where she believed at all. She had just moved into a small apartment in a quiet city block. It was nothing fancy, just 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a single large window that faced directly into the next building across the narrow street. At first, she liked the window. During the day, sunlight poured through it, giving the room a sense of warmth. At night, the glow of streetlights and the occasional shadow of people walking by made her feel less alone. It didn't take long for her to notice the man across from her. His blinds were almost always drawn, except for one small opening where she could see part of his face. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply looked out. Every evening, at nearly the same hour, she would glance up from her dinner or from folding laundry, and there he was, his eyes fixed in her direction. At first, she told herself it was harmless. People stare without thinking. Maybe he was lost in thought. Maybe he wasn't even looking at her. She tried to dismiss it. After all, living in a city means giving up some sense of privacy. But as the days turned into weeks, she could not ignore the regularity of it. Every night, the same light clicked on in his apartment, and the same narrow view of his face appeared between the blinds. He never moved much. His head barely shifted. His gaze never seemed to break. The woman began changing her routine. She would wait longer before turning on her own light, hoping to avoid his stare. She pulled her curtains closed earlier in the evening. But she could not shake the feeling that even behind the fabric, he was still there, waiting. One night, after a long day, she came home, shut her curtains tight, and settled in bed with a book. The building was silent except for the faint hum of traffic outside. She was just starting to drift to sleep when she heard it. A soft tapping. Not at the door. Not from above or below. The sound was at the window. Her heart skipped. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps a tree branch swaying in the wind. But when she remembered there were no trees near her apartment, the unease grew stronger. She tried to ignore it, but the tapping came again. Louder. More deliberate. 3 slow knocks against the glass, as though someone wanted her attention. The woman froze. Slowly, she pulled back her curtain just enough to peek. And that was when she saw it. Her neighbor's face. But it wasn't across the street. It wasn't behind the blinds in his window. It was right there, reflected in her own glass, as though he were standing inside her room. His expression was empty, almost lifeless. The same eyes she had seen countless times before were staring directly at her, but now from where he never should have been. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone as she tried to dial for help. Her hands shook as the ringing tone dragged on, each second heavier than the last. By the time the police arrived, the window was empty. Her apartment was quiet again. There was no sign of forced entry. No sign of anyone else having been inside. The officers told her it was probably a trick of the glass, a reflection, or her imagination after a stressful move. She wanted to believe them. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. The next day, She went outside and crossed the street to her neighbor's building. She wanted to prove to herself that he was real. That this was all a mistake. But when she asked the landlord about the man in the apartment opposite hers, the landlord gave her a confused look. That unit, he explained, had been empty for months. The windows had been sealed shut, and no one had lived there since the last tenant died the previous winter. She never slept near her window again. And to this day, she swears that what she saw staring back at her that night was not just a reflection, but the face of a man who should not have been there at all. Children see the world in ways adults often do not. To a child, shadows can take on shapes, voices can come from nowhere, and an empty room can feel alive. Parents are quick to dismiss these things as imagination, harmless games that vanish as a child grows older. But what happens when the things a child claims to see leave behind real evidence? When the games they play cross into something far more disturbing? This is the true story of a young family who moved to the countryside in search of peace and safety, only to find themselves confronted by a presence that seemed to reach out to their daughter, through the glass of her bedroom window. The family of 3 had settled into their new home in the quiet countryside. The house stood on a small piece of land, surrounded by tall grass and fields that stretched out toward the woods. It was the kind of place where nights were silent and the stars were clearer than they had ever seen in the city. Their daughter was 6 years old, full of energy and curiosity. She loved her new room, especially the large window that looked out onto the backyard. Every morning, she sat by the glass, pointing at birds and waving at the trees. At first, her parents thought nothing of it when she began waving at night as well. Before bed, she would sit by her window and raise her small hand as though greeting someone. Her parents assumed she was simply playing. But when they asked who she was waving to, the little girl answered plainly. The boy outside. Her parents laughed, thinking it was part of her imagination. Many children create imaginary friends when they feel lonely or when they are adjusting to a new environment. It was innocent enough. But the girl's insistence never faded. Every night, she would go to the same spot, lift her hand, and greet the boy who, according to her, stood in the yard just beyond the glass. Weeks passed, and the routine continued. The girl spoke more about the boy at the window. She told her parents that he wanted to play. She described him in detail, his hair, his clothes, and the way he stood still, almost as though he were waiting for her to come outside. Her parents smiled and nodded, but inside they began to feel uneasy. Children make things up, but this description was too consistent, too specific. Still, they told themselves it was nothing to worry about. That was until the night it rained. The parents tucked their daughter into bed as the storm rolled in. Hours later, after the wind had quieted, the father walked past her room. Out of habit, he glanced toward her window. And there, in the mud below the glass, were footprints. Small, barefoot tracks pressed clearly into the earth. They started at the edge of the field and led directly to the window, and then stopped. The man froze. He searched the yard with a flashlight but found nothing. The field was empty. No neighbors, no children nearby. When he returned inside, his wife saw the look on his face and knew he had seen something he could not explain. The next morning, they confronted their daughter gently, asking about the boy she kept waving to. She only nodded and said he was lonely, and that he wanted her to come outside. The final night began with another storm. The rain was heavy, striking the windows with force. The wind howled through the fields, rattling the shutters. Inside, the family tried to ignore the sound, but the little girl would not settle. She kept sitting up in bed, eyes fixed on her window. Her mother tucked her in again and again, but each time the girl whispered, "He's out there. He wants me to come play." Sometime after midnight, the parents awoke to a sound that chilled them to their bones. The window in their daughter's room was open, the curtains whipping violently in the storm. The bed was empty. Panic surged through them as they ran outside, shouting her name into the darkness. Over the roar of the rain, they swore they heard laughter, faint, high-pitched, and playful, echoing across the field. They searched desperately, their flashlights cutting across the wet grass. But there was no sign of her. Finally, after what felt like endless minutes, they found her. She was curled up under her bed, fast asleep, her clothes damp as though she had been outside. Her face was pale, her lips trembling as she mumbled in her sleep. When she opened her eyes, she looked at her parents with a calmness that unsettled them more than the storm itself. She whispered just 7 words. "He's still waiting outside the window." The family never spoke of the boy again. But the father admitted years later that whenever it rained, he still checked the mud beneath that window. And more often than not, the footprints returned. In the deep silence of a winter forest, where snow covers every path and muffles every sound, 2 friends rented a cabin that promised warmth, comfort, and peace. But when the sun went down and the shadows of the forest gathered, that peace was broken. For in that cabin was a window, a single piece of glass so wide and so clear, that it did not just show what stood before it, it revealed what should never have been seen at all. The story begins with Mark and Daniel, close friends in their early 30s. They had planned this winter trip months in advance. The goal was simple: escape city noise, relax in a secluded cabin, and enjoy the calm of nature. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by miles of untouched forest. Its most striking feature was a massive floor-to-ceiling window that looked out toward the trees. In daylight, it was beautiful. Snow fell in slow flakes against the glass, the forest stretched endlessly, and the view made the cabin feel open, welcoming. But as night approached, the atmosphere changed. The same window that had been breathtaking in the daylight now became a vast, dark mirror. With the forest hidden in shadows, the glass reflected every movement inside. At first, the friends joked about it, taking turns making faces at their own reflections. But it did not take long before that laughter faded. On their first night, Mark noticed something. As he sat by the fire, he caught movement beyond the glass. Just a faint shift, as if someone had walked between the trees. He blinked and told himself it was his imagination. But a half hour later, he saw it again, a darker shape moving slowly across the snowy ground. He called Daniel over, but by the time his friend looked, nothing was there. Daniel laughed, brushing it off as a trick of the eyes. But Mark stayed uneasy, glancing back at the window often. Later that night, as they prepared to sleep, Daniel stood near the glass. His voice dropped when he noticed something unusual. He said the reflection in the window didn't seem right. Mark joined him and stared closely. The reflection of the fire inside the cabin looked weaker, dimmer, as if the glass was not showing what was real. Daniel leaned closer. "That doesn't look like us," he whispered. In the reflection, their figures were standing by the glass, but their movements didn't match. When Daniel raised his hand, the reflection did not move with him. When Mark turned his head, the reflection still stared straight forward. The friends froze, staring at the glass in silence. Then, slowly, the reflection smiled. Neither Mark nor Daniel had moved their lips. Panic set in. They stumbled back from the window, breathing hard. Mark reached for his phone, but there was no signal in the remote woods. The firelight flickered against the walls, and every sound of the wind outside seemed louder than before. Daniel whispered, "It's not reflecting us, it's showing something else." And then they realized it. The window wasn't reflecting them at all. It wasn't a mirror of the cabin's interior. It was showing what stood behind them. Slowly, together, they turned around. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw them. Figures. 3, 4, maybe more. Shadowy forms standing in the corners of the cabin. Silent. Still. Watching. Mark's voice shook as he asked, "Who's there?" No answer came. The figures did not move. But their shapes grew clearer as the firelight shifted. They were tall, thin, and featureless, yet their presence filled the room with a coldness that made both friends shiver. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. The floorboards creaked. Daniel shouted, stumbling back toward the door. Mark grabbed his arm, but the glass window flashed brightly. In the reflection, the shadowy figures were smiling, moving closer, their hands reaching out. The cabin filled with screams as the friends realized they were not alone. The next morning, locals from the nearest town spoke quietly about the cabin when asked. One man, an older resident, shook his head and warned, "That cabin should have stayed empty. The windows there, they don't just show the forest. People say they are mirrors to the other side." The friends were never seen leaving. The cabin still stands in that forest. And that massive window still faces the trees. If you were to stand before it at night, you might see yourself staring back. But if you look too closely, you may realize the reflection is not you at all.